Well, hello everybody. It is Dr. Wayne, and I am coming at you with your Sunday morning Power Bible Study. Hope everybody is doing well this morning. I am pleased to bring you our first installment of the new lectionary year. I know you already listened to me, right, with my sermon, which was on Mark, right? That's the gospel of the year. During Advent, we hear a lot from Isaiah. And today's lesson comes from Isaiah chapter 64. Now, if you are an Isaiah file, you know what an Isaiah file is, right? Somebody who loves Isaiah. You would hear, chapter 64. Oh, yeah. You already know that Isaiah has 66 chapters, right? Every Isaiah file does. And so if we're reading out of chapter 64, we're coming out of the end of the book, right? The biblical, historical man, Isaiah ben Amoz, he lived in the 8th century. He was a northern kingdom prophet. When I say northern kingdom, I mean that part of Israel that was properly called Israel. And he ministered historically during the time of the Assyrian invasion of Israel. You know how we talk about the lost tribes of Israel? Well, in the 8th century, the northern kingdom was invaded. And when they were invaded, they were then taken off exile and scattered, actually. They were scattered. It wasn't like the exile of Judah. Don't want to confuse the two. That came later. But Israel, what it did is the northern kingdom, it intermingled. A lot of the Assyrians came in, and so there was a lot of intermarriage. And when we then see Jesus on the scene, remember, this is the part of Israel that Jesus would eventually come from, right? Remember, Jesus was from Nazareth. His headquarters for his ministry was in Capernaum, and this was right around the Sea of Galilee, that northern area. So Jesus grew up in this territory. Now, we are familiar with the Samaritans, right? Well, there was this area in northern Israel where a lot of intermingling happened. And when I say intermingling, I mean intermarriage. And the religion of let's call it this, the Yahwistic religion, which they, may or may not have been all that true to, really got watered down. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, the Samaritans, the northern kingdom, they were then looked upon as unclean and impure and not faithful to the task of the Yahwistic religion. Anyway, that's the ministry of the historical Isaiah. Now, when we turn the page, so the prophets back in those days were more than just, a lot of times when we hear about prophets, we think of an old wise man, right? With his crystal ball. Oh, let me look into your future. No, that's not what prophets were. Prophets were truth tellers. They were truth tellers. And they didn't specialize so much in foretelling, that's telling about the future, as they did forthtelling. What's the difference there, right? Forthtelling is when you, as a prophet, would tell the people, usually you gave your message to the king, if the king would hear it, and you would say what you had to say to call the people forth, to evoke a certain response. Thus says the word of the Lord. If you don't change your ways, this is going to happen. Well, when we look at prophecy, a lot of times we put it in the category of this is all the prophet just talking about the future and whatever. It doesn't really have any relevance to his time. Yeah, it really did. So when after the historical Isaiah passed on, it's very clear by looking at the prophecies of the book of Isaiah that that's not where the ministry or the prophecies of Isaiah, the school of Isaiah. Imagine a prophet so popular that a school arose, like people like, the Isaic school, and other prophets would study and learn and write. And what we have in Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 is that historical Isaiah of the 8th century, 700s. When we turn the page to chapters like 40 and beyond, it's definitely a different story. When Judah, the southern kingdom, was exiled in the early 6th century, they were taken to Babylonia at the time. And when we look at the chapters in Isaiah from like chapter 39 to like 54, 55, I think it's 55, 40 to 55, it really looks like that situation of, these guys are in exile. And the prophet's message seemed to be directed at people who weren't in the promised land. They were in a foreign land, and they were wanting to come home. They were asking questions. Where is the Lord? Where is the Lord? Is the Lord even with us anymore? Because remember, what was the telltale sign that the Lord was with them? It was the fact that the temple and what was done in the temple was something, it was meaningful. It brought God close to them. They didn't know how to be Jewish in a foreign land. The only way they knew how to be Jewish was with the temple in the land that God had promised them. Now, even the word Jewish, it came from this time. What time am I talking about? I'm talking about after Judah's exile in the 6th century. Yeah. Did you hear the word Judah? Jew. Yeah, that's where they got it. So yeah, that's the way they came to be known. And it wasn't a name that they took on themselves. It was simply a name that they started to become because, those people from Judea, just call them Jews. That's what they did. So the Babylonian kingdom that exiled the southern Judah then got taken over by the Persians. Enter Cyrus of Persia. Cyrus was one of these enlightened leaders of the time, and instead of just like putting the hammer down and we'll exile them all and make them even more despondent so that they'll even forget wherever they came from and they'll intermingle with us, blah, blah. No, he had a different tack. His tack was, let them go back to their land. They'll still be our subjects, but it's important that they get to practice their religion. I don't know if Cyrus was that enlightened of a leader. The Bible and the biblical prophets speak of Cyrus as acting for God, acting towards God's people in a positive way. So he allows the exiles to return. So once they have returned, okay, now we're getting real late in the Old Testament. I'm all leading up to where we are here in the book of Isaiah. The task then arises. Okay, all right, so we're back in Jerusalem. So what? There's no temple. There's no walls. There's no walls to the city. So that's the time that we hear from this portion of Isaiah. It's sometimes called Third Isaiah or Trito Isaiah. because it definitely reflects a time when they are searching for, okay, God, are you really with us? We're not so sure. We're not so sure. But we'll keep talking. We'll keep talking. So the prophets gave, so I mentioned earlier on, the prophets frequently, we think of them as foretellers, telling the future. Just get that out of your mind. They're forth tellers. They call people forth into a way of being. Now, there's a couple of ways they do that. One of the ways that the prophets would do that was to tell it like it is. They would say, you guys have really blown it. And you're not going to be happy how this is going to go. And so that's the kind of prophet Jeremiah was. And guess what? Was Jeremiah popular? No. Why? Because he talked to kings about what they were doing wrong and saying, this isn't going to go well. This is not going to go well. It didn't. And Jeremiah ended up being one of those prophets that got exiled. Isaiah, the second Isaiah, was amongst the exiles. This Isaiah that we're dealing with in chapter 64, all of the latter part, I think it's 56 to 66, those 11 chapters, is dealing with a post-exilic time. Now, what do I mean by post-exilic? Exilic means that's when they're exiled. Post-exilic means, oh, they've been allowed to return, and now they're dealing with how to reconstruct their lives, their worship, and all of that. So in the post-exilic time, challenges arose. Yeah, that's like, okay, well, one of the things that they were allowed to do was to rebuild, not just the city and the city walls, but the temple. And if you rebuild the temple, what can happen? That's right, worship, the kind of worship that they had, the kind of worship that was an example of what they knew was mediating to God for them. So there was a time during this post-exilic time, and spoiler alert, they do eventually rebuild the temple. It's the temple that we call the second temple. The first temple was the one that Solomon built. The second temple is the temple of the post-exilic period. The second temple, with the accretions, expansions, infusion of money, and all from Herod the Great, that's the temple then that Jesus saw and walked amongst and condemned, right? That's what is going to get built. So why am I going through all this? Because in this chapter of Isaiah, it's important that we realize what has happened and what hasn't happened. One of the reasons why we have difficulty with the prophets, and when I say difficulty, I don't mean like, well, I really don't like what that prophet said. No, I don't mean that kind of difficulty. I mean difficulty understanding, like reading it and saying like, what the heck is he talking about here? I have no idea. So when we understand what has happened and what has not yet happened, then we can read the words and say, oh, that makes sense. So here we are, first Sunday in Advent, right? Advent is a time of what? Waiting. And I don't mean waiting like a lot of times we think of it as like if you're like in the waiting room of a doctor's office. A waiting room is a doctor's office. The doctor's in there, you got an appointment, and you're waiting. The doctor's late, doctor hasn't, whatever, but we're not talking about that kind of waiting. We're talking about the kind of waiting where, okay, let's say you're in a doctor's office in a waiting room, and when you're in the waiting room, you have a deadly disease, and you're not even sure there's a doctor. You're not even sure there's a doctor. That's what this kind of Advent waiting is about. The waiting that we see reflected in Isaiah chapter 64. So don't think waiting isn't just the inconvenience of like, oh, well, I guess I got to wait until December 25th to open these presents. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of waiting where it's pregnant waiting. It's fearful waiting. It's like a not sure kind of waiting. These are the steps that we must go through. It's all human. If we are going to properly receive what God wants to give us. This is the context for Isaiah chapter 64. How do you like that? I spent 15 minutes talking about the context, and I'm still going to get done in 15 more minutes, 30 total. This is my promise, right? Okay, Isaiah chapter 64, verses 1 and following. The whole chapter has 12 verses. We're only, the lectionary we heard this morning was just verses 1 through 9. But the whole pericope, okay, that's a new word for you, right? Pericope, P-E-R-I-C-O-P-E, pericope. The whole pericope of, that's a self-standing unit, okay? Actually started back in chapter 63 as a communal lament, like chapter 63, if you have your Bible, it's like back to like chapter 7, or verse 7 of chapter 63. It starts a lament, a communal lament. What's a lament? A lament is a prayer that sounds an awful lot like a complaint. A lament is a, oh, woe is me, oh, Lord, why, Lord, why me? Do you still love me, Lord? Yeah, that kind of thing. That's what a lament is. That's what this pericope is all about. So chapter 64, verses 1 through 9, is toward the end of it, where there's a pleading to God. Listen to this. Isaiah chapter 64, verse 1. Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down, so that the mountains would quake at your presence. As when fire kindles brushwood and the fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, so that the nations might tremble at your presence. So what is this? This is a yearning in that post-exilic time. They're back in Jerusalem. They're trying to get their lives together. They haven't got things back together. And they are asking God to do what? Can you just show up for us like you did before? You know, remember that time when we were, slaves in Egypt, and you helped us out of there. And then you took us through the wilderness, and that mountain where you revealed your law to us. You quaked, and the mountains, you appeared, and this is the kind of, they're like saying, oh, can you just please come back to us the way you've been before? Verse 3, Isaiah 64, verse 3. When you did awesome deeds that we did not expect. Does that remind you of something? Remember when they were in Egypt, and those, we call them plagues, did not expect. God just did it. You came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. That's an interesting, one of the things that we deal with in prophecy is, and it's important that we get this, the genre of literature that we're actually reading is not prose, is not narrative, it is poetry. And poetry doesn't have a problem repeating the same thing over and over again. They like to say the same things over and over again. They like to say things twice. But this one, yeah, you saw that back in verse 1. So that the mountains would quake at your presence. Here, you came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. Okay, so what I'm trying to say, okay, so in poetry, it's perfectly all right to use to use anthropomorphisms. An anthropomorphism is a word which is speaks using a human characteristic for God. Well, not for God, but it's any time you make an inanimate object an animate object. The mountains here are treated as living beings, quaking, right? That's what we're talking about. Right. Verse 4, Isaiah 64:4. From ages past, no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you. One of the things that you do when you're in a lament and you are like going for the big ask at the end, what you do is you start buttering up God. Oh, remember what you did for us? Yeah. Oh, and there's nobody. You're like the best God ever. That's the way you did that. Who works for those who wait for him. Verse 5. You meet those who gladly do right, those who remember you in your ways. But you were angry, and we sinned because you hid yourself. We transgressed. It sounds like they're saying that they're not taking responsibility for their sin. It sounds like they're saying, well, if you hadn't abandoned us, we wouldn't have gone wrong. That's not, they don't have the same relationship to cause and effect that we do, okay? When I say they, I'm talking about in this day and age. Turn of the century, 5th, 6th century BCE, before the Common Era. They don't have that same relationship that we do between cause and effect. For them, God caused everything. There was absolutely nothing that happened that wasn't brought on by God. This is the way they thought. And it's something that it wasn't like they were about to change. Like, who was that? What was that evil thing? They didn't take that into consideration at all. Remember during the Exodus, or before the Exodus, when they were still slaves? And one of the things that Exodus tells us is that the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. And it also said that the Pharaoh hardened his heart. Those kinds of descriptions are not intended in the realm of cause and effect. You were angry and we sinned because you hid yourself, we transgressed. Hiding yourself. Oh, there's a big thing in the Old Testament about God hiding himself. Like the idea that, oh, no looksies, that peekaboo thing of like, oh, if God can't see us, then God must not be around. That's the way they perceived it when things went badly. Oh, he's hidden his face from us. Because if his face were toward us, we would have some good things coming. But we're not feeling it right now. Yeah. Okay. Verse 6. Isaiah 64, verse 6. We have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a filthy cloth. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. So here's the expression of mea culpa. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. I'm to blame. I've done it. We've all become like one who's unclean. So they are now feeling the differentiation between the clean and the unclean is huge. Huge in Judaism. So the fact that they say we have all become like one who is unclean, it's a realization that, oh, there's absolutely no favor. There's absolutely no reason for God. We're not worthy for God. All our righteous deeds like filthy cloth, we all fade like a leaf. Verse 7, there is no one who calls on your name or attempts to take hold of you. For you have hidden your face from us and have delivered us into the hand of our iniquity. This is a description of, imagine that you see God as so disconnected from you, so far from you, that you can't even imagine. It's like, I can't go. Yeah, you know what? It's kind of like in the old days when people didn't feel worthy to go to church. It's like, especially if you're raised Catholic, I haven't done confession in so long. I just can't. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. I just a few weeks ago, I was serving communion. And so somebody that doesn't normally come to our church, and she refused communion, saying just that. I haven't been to church in what? She's like, oh no, there's no way. That's kind of like what they're expressing here. Verse 7. For you have delivered us into the hand of our iniquity. It's like, how can I call on the Lord? How can I possibly, why would I want that anger directly at me? It's like, no, I'm afraid of the Lord. I'm not going to talk to the Lord or ask anything from the Lord. That's the idea. But here, look, verse 8. Yet, O Lord, in Lamentations, when you lament, you gotta just get down to the bare facts. You gotta go through the process. That we wish you would do for us what you used to do, but yet, but you've turned away from us. We've sinned, and all of our deeds are like filthy rags. Yet, Lord, you are our Father. Yeah, that's what it says right here. Look, verse 8. Yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. So, they are saying that even though they recognize the judgment from God, that they fear the anger of God, that they brought it on themselves by their inability to stay faithful to what they were supposed to be and do, yet they still call God their Father. We're the clay, you are our potter, we are all the work of your hand. This is where it's supposed to funnel down to, folks. Whenever we're in our prayers of dismay and disruption and, woe is me, you know what? We've got to come down to this point of, but you know what? Here's the bottom line. I know that you're the boss. I'm the one to be molded by you. I'm your work. Mold me, make me. This is the beginning of transformation, folks. A powerful relationship to what's so is the beginning of transformation. Verse 9. This is our last verse. Do not be exceedingly angry, O Lord, and do not remember my iniquity forever. Now, consider, we are your people. Yeah, that's covenant language. Covenant language is when you say, you are our God, we are people. Or if it's coming from God, it's like, I am your God and you are my people. You are my people and I am your God. Covenant language. This is covenant language. The recognition is that even though we're not feeling it, we're not feeling the love, we know that you're our people. Why do we read this during Advent? So in Advent, like I said, it's a time of waiting. It's a time of anticipation. It's a time for us to get real with ourselves about, okay, who have we been being? Who have we been being? Yeah, sure, Christmas is going to come anyway. You know what? And people are going to get you presents anyway, right? And they don't get you presents because you're naughty or nice. That's Santa. But no. Why would we not then see God as, is he really going to pull me out this time? This is the way they thought back then. This is the beginning of the process of preparing ourselves for the gift that comes at Christmas. We can't talk about that yet because we still got 4 weeks to go. But this is where our life is, and we must get it in gear. We must be honest with God now, or we're not going to get the blessings of the gift. There you go. 30 minutes. How do you like that? So, hope you all have a good Sunday. And this is Dr. Wayne signing off for now. Peace.